The ground moved first. On Commercial Street in Boston's North End, at 20 minutes before 1 o'clock on the afternoon of January the 15th, 1919, the cobblestones shuddered with a vibration that workers at the adjacent freight house recognized not as sound but as pressure, a subsonic wave traveling through earth and timber and the soles of their boots before any human ear had time to process what was coming. Then came the groan, low and tearing, the sound of riveted steel giving way along seams that had been silently failing for 3 years. And then the wall of the Great Molasses tank on the waterfront, 50 feet tall, 90 feet wide, holding 2.3 million gallons of warm, fermenting crude molasses at a density roughly 1.5 times that of water, simply ceased to exist. The wave that followed was not a flood, it was a physical force, dark brown and steaming faintly in the January air, moving at speeds witnesses described as faster than a running man, rising 25 feet high at the point of rupture, carrying the kinetic energy not of water, but of something heavier, denser, more relentless. Steel sections of the tank wall became projectiles. One struck a support column of the Boston Elevated Railway with sufficient force to buckle the structure. 14,000 tons of stored liquid energy swept across Commercial Street in seconds. 21 people died, 150 more were injured. The molasses, cooling as it spread, thickened around the living and the dead alike, holding them with a grip that rescuers described as nearly impossible to break. To understand why this tank existed, why it was built the way it was built, and why it was certain to fail long before anyone in authority acknowledged that certainty, you have to go back to 1915, to a war economy, a prohibition deadline, and a man who signed off on a design no licensed structural engineer had ever formally reviewed. In 1915, the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, was not a manufacturer in the traditional sense. It was a financial architecture built to extract profit from the gap between cheap Caribbean raw materials and wartime demand for industrial alcohol, which was essential to the production of smokeless powder, munitions lacquer, and high-grade explosives flowing to the Allied fronts in Europe. The demand was not theoretical. It was urgent, and it was enormous, and it was producing profits that made ordinary manufacturing economics look modest by comparison. Arthur Gell was USIA's treasurer, a man whose professional formation was entirely in accounting and corporate management, not in structural engineering or materials science. He was the man who decided Boston's North End waterfront would become the company's primary East Coast storage and distilling hub, and he authorized construction of the Great Tank without commissioning an independent structural engineering review. This was not negligence born of ignorance alone. It was a decision shaped by two converging pressures, time and cost, neither of which left room for the slower disciplines of structural verification. The United States was moving toward prohibition. The trajectory of temperance legislation was visible to anyone reading the political horizon in 1915, and USIA's strategy was explicit. Stockpile as much raw molasses as possible before the distilling market was legally extinguished. Speed mattered. Cost mattered. The tank that emerged from these priorities was contracted through a fabricator whose engineering credentials the historical record treats with persistent skepticism. It was assembled on the waterfront using steel plate that was, according to engineering testimony produced years later at civil inquest, below the yield strength specifications the structure's dimensions required. The tank was not designed with a safety factor commensurate with its scale. It was designed with a financial factor. That difference would take 3 years to collect its accounting. The construction of the tank, undertaken in 1915 and 1916 with materials fabricated in the American Midwest and assembled on the Boston waterfront, was remarkable chiefly for what it lacked. There were no formal stress calculations filed with the city. There was no independent inspection of the steel plate before installation. There was no review of the rivet schedule against the hydrostatic load the seams would carry at full capacity. The testing protocol, such as it was, consisted of filling the tank partially with water on a single occasion. That procedure could detect gross and immediate structural failure, but it could not assess cumulative fatigue, thermal cycling behavior, or the long-term integrity of riveted seams under repeated loading and pressure variation. The rivets themselves were the structural connective tissue of the entire vessel. They were installed under field conditions that produced uneven clamping forces across the seam lines, a fact engineering witnesses would later identify as a primary contributor to the failure. No expansion joints were incorporated into the design to accommodate the thermal cycling inherent to the tank's operation. Molasses arrived warm from Caribbean shipment. It cooled during storage in the Boston winter and then expanded again with the heat generated by fermentation. Each thermal cycle placed alternating tension and compression on the rivet seams, invisibly and incrementally accumulating stress damage that routine inspections were not designed to detect because inspections that addressed structural fatigue were never planned. The tank was built to hold. It was not built to be questioned. This is the first and central irony of the structure's existence. USIA presented the molasses tank to the city of Boston as a passive, inert storage vessel, the safest, least dynamic piece of industrial equipment on the waterfront. It required no boiler inspection, no pressure certification, no mechanical oversight, no licensed engineer's stamp, because it was presented as just a container, a vessel, a tank. Yet the tank was, in physical reality, the single largest concentration of stored gravitational and fermentation energy in the entire harbor district. It was passive in the same way a compressed spring is passive. The energy was present. It was always present. The only question was whether the material containing it would outlast the forces applied to it. The answer, accumulating invisibly in the steel's crystal structure year after year, was already being written. The tank began leaking almost immediately after it was first filled, and this fact entered the historical record not through corporate admission, but through neighborhood observation. Children in the North End discovered they could collect molasses from the seams of the great tank by simply walking to its base and scraping the dark brown material from the riveted joints where the steel had already begun to weep under hydrostatic load. Adults in the neighborhood noted the sweetish smell that hung around the base of the structure in warmer months. Arthur Gell's response to reports of the leaking condition, documented in corporate correspondence introduced at the 1920 civil inquest, was to order the tank painted brown to conceal the staining visible on the exterior steel. The leaks were not investigated structurally, they were camouflaged cosmetically. No structural engineer was retained to assess what continuous seam leakage indicated about the integrity of the vessel. No inspection report was commissioned. The maintenance logic applied to the tank was the same logic a foreman might apply to a leaking pipe coupling: identify the visible symptom, apply a patch or sealant to the exterior surface, return the vessel to service, and log it as a maintenance action rather than a structural warning. The deeper question, what does continuous seam leakage in a riveted steel vessel holding 14,000 tons of fermenting liquid indicate about the long-term structural condition of that vessel, was never formally asked, because asking it formally would have required either committing significant funds to structural remediation or removing the tank from service entirely. And neither option was economically acceptable to a company whose entire Boston operation was premised on filling that tank as many times as possible before prohibition made filling it illegal. The years between 1916 and 1918 were years of escalating throughput and accelerating fatigue. The war in Europe created insatiable demand for industrial alcohol, and USIA's Boston operation ran the great tank through fill and drain cycles with increasing frequency, each cycle representing both a profitable transaction and an invisible increment of cumulative structural damage. Each cycle subjected the lower rivet seams to the full hydrostatic pressure of the molasses column at maximum fill, a pressure that the steel was already demonstrably struggling to contain, as the continued leaking made plain. Each cycle subjected the entire structure to the thermal expansion and contraction of the contents, stressing the joints in directions for which the original fabrication had made no engineered provision. The steel plate at the base of the tank, under constant hydrostatic load from the mass of material above it, underwent slow plastic deformation in the regions between rivet lines. Deformation measurable in fractions of an inch, but physically real and cumulative over dozens of fill cycles. None of this was monitored, none of this was measured, none of this was even conceptually present in the maintenance framework USIA applied to the structure. The tank kept standing, which USIA interpreted as confirmation that the tank was sound, that the original construction had been adequate, that the leaking seams were a minor cosmetic issue rather than a systemic indicator. This is the logic of normalization, the substitution of continued operation for structural verification, the replacement of engineering assessment with the empirical observation that nothing catastrophic has yet occurred. In the vocabulary of industrial failure analysis, it is one of the most reliable precursors to catastrophic collapse. The tank did not need to exhibit dramatic distress to be in serious structural jeopardy. It needed only to be asked the right questions by someone with the authority and the instruments to answer them. No one asked, no one had been given the mandate to ask. That was not an accident. By the winter of 1918, the North End had organized itself around the tank's presence with the thoroughness of a neighborhood that had absorbed an industrial intrusion into its daily geography, and that no longer perceived it as exceptional. The Boston Elevated Railway ran its steel columns and elevated trackway within a few dozen yards of the tank's base, carrying thousands of commuters daily past a structure whose structural condition no city inspector had formally assessed since its construction. Engine Company 31 of the Boston Fire Department operated from a firehouse roughly 50 yards from the tank's southern wall. Their crews walking past the great steel cylinder on every shift, its brown-painted exterior giving no indication of the deteriorating condition of the joints beneath the paint. Freight rail lines serving the harbor ran directly adjacent to the tank's foundation piling. Wooden tenement buildings occupied the blocks immediately north and west, their residents going about daily life within the structure's failure radius. The tank was not isolated from the city. It was embedded in it, a massive vessel of stored energy positioned at the center of a dense urban web of infrastructure and habitation, its potential failure radius overlapping with every surrounding structure, every surrounding life, every element of the neighborhood's physical and economic fabric. The Sanborn fire insurance maps of the period recorded the tank's position relative to neighboring structures with cartographic precision, but insurance logic in this era was calibrated to assess fire risk, not structural collapse risk. The maps documented the neighborhood's vulnerability without naming what was vulnerable. The tank was visible on every map. Its danger was invisible on all of them. The final sequence of loading began on January 13th, 1919, when a cargo ship from Puerto Rico delivered a fresh consignment of molasses to the Commercial Street facility, raising the tank's fill level to near capacity. The temperature in Boston that week had fallen to approximately 2 degrees Fahrenheit in the days preceding the delivery, then climbed sharply as a weather system moved through a temperature swing of nearly 40 degrees within the 24 hours immediately preceding the collapse. Warm molasses expansion in a vessel whose walls have no provision for volumetric change generates pressure against those walls. Fermenting molasses, which the material in the tank was actively doing, generates carbon dioxide as a byproduct of ongoing microbial activity, adding gas pressure to the already elevated hydrostatic load from the liquid column. The riveted steel walls of the tank, already compromised along the seam lines by 3 years of fatigue cycling, repeated thermal stress and cosmetically managed leakage, were now carrying a combined load that had never been formally calculated against the actual yield strength of the steel installed. The hydrostatic pressure from the full column of dense molasses, the gas pressure from active fermentation, and the thermal expansion stress from the rapid temperature rise converged on the rivet seams simultaneously. Workers near the tank in the days before the failure reported sounds from the structure, groaning, creaking, low metallic complaints that they had learned through 3 years of familiarity to classify as normal operational noise. The tank had always made sounds. The sounds had never preceded catastrophe before. That history of no consequence was the last cognitive barrier between the workers and the recognition of immediate danger, and it held until it was irrelevant. At 12:40 in the afternoon on January 15th, 1919, the lower rivet seam on the south face of the tank failed in a propagating fracture that the physical evidence later indicated ran the length of the seam in a fraction of a second. The mechanics of riveted steel failure under hydrostatic overpressure are unforgiving in their speed. The material holds and holds and holds at the elastic limit, and then the crack initiates at the weakest point in the seam, likely a rivet hole where stress concentration had been highest throughout the vessel's operational life, and the fracture runs. 2 large sections of the tank's steel skin were propelled outward as ballistic projectiles by the pressure differential between the interior and the outside air. One section, carrying the momentum of tons of steel plate, accelerated by millions of pounds of hydrostatic force, struck a support column of the Boston Elevated Railway with enough force to crack the column and derail a freight car on the elevated structure above. Other steel fragments were reported by witnesses to have been thrown hundreds of feet across Commercial Street and into adjacent structures, embedding in walls and punching through wooden building facades. The molasses wave that followed the wall's disappearance was the release of 14,000 tons of dense liquid from a height of 50 feet, and it behaved not like a water wave, but like something heavier and more viscous and more final. Reports from the scene recorded the wave height at 25 feet near the point of rupture, with the wave maintaining height and energy as it crossed Commercial Street and struck the surrounding buildings with a force that witnesses later described as physically incomprehensible. The firehouse of Engine Company 31 was engulfed. The freight house was swept. Workers on the freight rail line were carried from their positions and deposited against structures 50 feet and 100 feet from where they had been standing. The molasses reached the support columns of the elevated railway, coated the cobblestones to a depth that trapped horses in place and overturned automobiles, and forced its way through every opening in the ground floor facades of surrounding buildings. 21 people died. Among the dead were laborers working the freight yard at the moment of failure, a firefighter caught in the structural damage to the firehouse, and residents of the surrounding blocks who were simply present in the geography of the tank's failure radius on that afternoon and had no reason to be anywhere else. 150 people were injured. The molasses, surrendering its warmth rapidly to the January air, thickened as it spread, transitioning from a wave into a medium of obstruction that rescue workers had no equipment or protocol to address. Horses could not be freed by pulling, bodies could not be reached by wading. The material had trapped the living alongside the dead in a substance that did not yield to ordinary physical intervention, and the rescuers who entered it found themselves slowing, their own movements impeded by the same viscosity that was killing the people they had come to save. Cleanup lasted weeks. Estimates of the labor required ran into the tens of thousands of man-hours, with workers using shovels, hoses, and eventually seawater pumped from the harbor to gradually dissolve and remove the material that had settled into every surface, joint, and cavity on Commercial Street and the surrounding blocks. Boston Harbor was discolored brown for months as the molasses was dispersed by tidal action through the harbor's water. The structural damage inventory was substantial. The elevated railway column, sections of the freight house, the firehouse, and harborfront infrastructure that served the commercial shipping economy of the entire North End waterfront were all affected. The civil lawsuit that followed was unprecedented in the history of Massachusetts. 119 plaintiffs filed claims against USYA, and the proceedings became among the most technically complex and protracted legal actions the state's courts had processed. Hugh Ogden, appointed by the court as auditor to assess the technical evidence and render findings of fact, oversaw a process that ran to 45 days of formal testimony and accumulated more than 3,000 individual exhibits drawn from corporate records, engineering analyses, weather data, structural calculations, and witness accounts. Arthur Geld testified under oath about the decisions he had made and the information he had possessed. Engineering experts retained by the plaintiffs offered structural analyses of the failed vessel based on the physical evidence recovered from the site. USIA's initial defense was that the tank had not failed structurally, but had been destroyed by an anarchist bomb. The company advanced this theory with deliberate calculation in the politically charged atmosphere of 1919, when labor radicalism and political violence were prominent in public discourse. That defense collapsed entirely under the weight of the metallurgical and structural evidence. Fracture patterns in recovered steel sections were inconsistent with explosive overpressure and consistent with ductile overload failure at the rivet seams. The bomb theory was not a mistaken engineering hypothesis arrived at in good faith. It was a litigation strategy designed to shift liability to an unidentifiable party. It did not survive scrutiny. Ogden's final report, issued in 1925, was a document of forensic precision and institutional clarity. It found that the steel used in the tank's construction was substandard relative to the structural demands the vessel's dimensions imposed on it. It found that the construction process had been defective in ways that compromised the structural integrity of the rivet seams from the first filling. It found that USIA's management had possessed knowledge of the tank's leaking condition over a period of years, and had responded to that knowledge with cosmetic concealment rather than structural remediation. It assigned liability to the company without equivocation. The settlement that followed, $628,000 distributed among the plaintiffs, closed the legal chapter of the disaster after 6 years of proceedings. The report was, by any measure available in 1925, a thorough and honest accounting of how the tank had been built, how it had been operated, and how it had failed. It named the failure mode. It traced the failure mode to its origin in the construction decisions of 1915 and 1916. It connected the origin to the institutional logic that had governed the tank's operation through 3 years of visible warning signs. It was a complete picture of industrial catastrophe, documented with evidentiary rigor. And then, the engineering profession and the regulatory bodies of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts did something that the report's thoroughness made conspicuous by contrast. They changed almost nothing that mattered structurally. No new mandatory construction standard for large industrial liquid storage tanks was enacted as a direct legislative consequence of the Boston disaster. The Massachusetts Board of Boiler Rules expanded its inspection authority in the years that followed, but the specific category of large, unpressurized or low-pressure liquid storage vessels, the precise category the molasses tank had occupied, remained outside comprehensive mandatory inspection frameworks for years. The machine had been measured, analyzed, and documented with extraordinary care. The system that produced the machine, the permitting culture, the absence of independent structural review requirements, the institutional normalization of visible failure signals had been identified clearly in Ogden's report and adjusted only at the edges. They proved exactly how it failed, but they changed almost nothing. The forces that ultimately removed large molasses storage tanks from the Boston waterfront were not safety regulations produced by the disaster's investigation. They were the 18th Amendment and the economics of its consequences. Prohibition took effect in January 1920 and destroyed the industrial alcohol distilling market for which USIA's entire Boston operation had been constructed. The economic logic that had driven Arthur Gell in 1915 to commission a tank of maximum scale without adequate engineering review, the logic of filling the vessel as many times as possible before the legal window closed, was now permanently irrelevant because the legal window had closed and taken the market with it. USIA's Boston distilling operation wound down. The site on Commercial Street was cleared. The regulatory evolution that proceeded through the 1920s and the 1930s in pressure vessel engineering, driven by the accumulated record of industrial failures across multiple industries and multiple decades, gradually produced improved standards for storage vessel construction and inspection. The specific institutional response to Boston was absorbed into this broader evolution rather than driving it. The repeal of prohibition in 1933 restored legal distilling, but the industrial ecology that had produced the Commercial Street tank, the combination of wartime urgency, maximum scale storage economics, minimum engineering oversight culture, and a waterfront embedded in a dense urban neighborhood, never reassembled in the same configuration. The site on Commercial Street today carries no visible evidence of what it once held. A small park occupies part of the ground where the tank stood. A parking area covers adjacent sections. A historical marker acknowledges the disaster in the compressed civic language of public commemoration. The Boston Elevated Railway that the tank's debris struck was demolished decades ago, its elevated structure removed as the city rebuilt its transit infrastructure. Engine Company 31 operates from a different location in the North End. The foundation pilings of the great tank remain underground, documented in historical surveys, invisible from the street. On cold January afternoons, when the temperature approximates the conditions of that final morning and the harbor wind carries the particular clarity of a New England winter, there is nothing on the surface of the earth at Commercial Street to indicate that this ordinary urban ground was once the floor of a catastrophe. The subsonic vibration through the cobblestones is gone. The low metallic groan of steel under hydrostatic load is gone. The smell of warm fermenting molasses hanging over the harbor is gone. The tank that held 14,000 tons of stored energy was approved by a treasurer rather than an engineer. It leaked for 3 years while its owners painted over the evidence and called the leaking normal. It was filled to capacity on a warming January morning with no one in authority equipped to recognize that the loading conditions had finally and fatally aligned. That tank does not exist. It was never rebuilt in a better engineered form. It was never replaced with a successor design that incorporated the lessons of its failure. The industrial logic that created it was made obsolete first by law and then by economics. What replaced it on the waterfront was not a safer version of the same machine, but simply the absence of the machine entirely. The most dangerous structure on the Boston waterfront was not retired by engineering reform or regulatory mandate. It was removed by history. The silence it left behind, on the ground, in the harbor, in the air over the North End on a cold January afternoon, is absolute and permanent. The machine that stored more energy than anyone had calculated is simply and quietly gone.